The temporary bridge at Coldwater Training Range looked harmless in the early morning light. A steel and timber span laid across a narrow ravine to simulate rapid movement conditions. Its warning placards clean, its load ratings freshly painted, and its approach lined with cones that made it feel more official than dangerous. And gathered near it were young soldiers buzzing with confidence, adjusting straps, joking over radios, and treating the crossing like another checkbox on a schedule that promised no surprises. Standing slightly apart from them was the veteran assigned as a civilian safety observer, an elderly American male with a white beard and a face carved by years of sun and consequence. Wearing a faded red shirt tucked into blue jeans, worn boots scuffed at the toes, and carrying a small notebook that never left his hand. He studied the bridge the way a man studies weather, quietly, patiently, noticing details others ignored. When the platoon leader briefed the movement plan, vehicles first, then troops, timed intervals based on the bridge's posted rating, the veteran stepped forward just enough to be heard and said calmly, "You should lighten the load before the first crossing." The words landed wrong, not because they were loud or disrespectful, but because they interrupted certainty. A few soldiers exchanged glances and smirked. One muttered, "It's rated for twice that," tapping the sign with his knuckle. Another laughed louder, "Guess the old man doesn't trust new steel." The platoon leader smiled politely, the kind of smile that ended conversations without engaging them. "We've got engineering approval," he replied, voice carrying reassurance. "We'll follow the plan." The veteran didn't argue. He simply pointed at the ravine walls where erosion had eaten into the soil, then at the bridge supports where water stains marked uneven settling, and said quietly, "Ratings assume perfect conditions. This isn't that." Laughter followed again, sharper this time, because warnings were easier to mock than reconsider. A young specialist leaned toward his buddy and whispered, "If it fails, we'll write it up. That's what reports are for." The veteran heard it and looked away, because he had learned that once confidence turned into humor, logic rarely made it through. Trucks idled nearby, their combined weight vibrating through the ground, and the veteran felt it through his boots. The low hum that told him the earth underneath wasn't as still as it looked. He remembered bridges like this from years ago, different wars, different places, where posted numbers meant nothing once mud, heat, and time changed the equation. The platoon sergeant clapped his hands and called for movement, and the first vehicle rolled forward, soldiers watching with bored interest as its tires met the bridge deck and the structure flexed slightly, just enough to be felt but not enough to alarm. "See," someone said, grinning. "Solid." The veteran's jaw tightened, not in anger, but in calculation, because initial flex was normal, cumulative stress was the killer. As the vehicle crept across, the bridge groaned softly, a metallic sound lost beneath engine noise and laughter, and when it reached the far side without incident, the soldiers relaxed further, confidence reinforced. "Told you," a corporal said, looking directly at the veteran now. "All good." The veteran nodded once, not conceding, just acknowledging what had happened so far. "That was one," he replied. "Problems show up after repetition." The platoon leader waved it off and ordered the second vehicle forward, and this time the soldiers didn't even watch closely, already mentally moving on, joking about lunch and timelines. The veteran stepped back, eyes fixed on the bridge's center span, watching how the deck didn't quite rebound to its original height, how a hairline vibration lingered longer than it should have. He opened his notebook, wrote a single word, "load," and closed it again because he knew the real test was coming, not from one crossing, but from the moment they stacked weight on certainty. As the second vehicle reached the midpoint, the bridge gave a sharper groan, louder than before, and a few soldiers looked up, curiosity replacing boredom. "Probably just settling," someone joked. The veteran didn't speak this time. He watched the bolts, the joints, the way the structure answered weight with memory, and he felt the familiar, unwelcome certainty settle in his chest. They had crossed the line where a warning could still be preventive and entered the space where it would soon become a lesson. Keep listening, and which city are you listening from? And if you enjoy the story, please subscribe for more. By the time the second vehicle cleared the bridge, the morning confidence had hardened into certainty, the most dangerous stage of belief, and the young soldiers barely glanced at the structure anymore, already convinced the veteran's concern belonged to a different era where steel was weaker and calculations less precise. The platoon leader checked his watch, nodded to the platoon sergeant, and ordered the next phase without hesitation. Tighter spacing, quicker crossings, no delays, because the schedule mattered more than discomfort. The veteran shifted his weight and felt the vibration deepen through the soles of his boots as engines idled closer together, the combined mass humming through the ravine like a warning too low-pitched for excitement. He stepped forward again, voice calm but firmer this time. "You're stacking stress," he said. "Let the bridge rest between loads." A corporal laughed outright. "It's not a person, sir," he said. "Steel doesn't need brakes." A few soldiers chuckled, one adding, "This thing's probably stronger than we are." The veteran didn't argue physics. He pointed instead to the far anchoring plate where a bolt had rotated slightly, its chalk mark no longer aligned. "It's already moving," he said quietly. The platoon leader glanced at it for half a second, then looked away, unwilling to let a detail slow momentum. "We're within limits," he replied. "Proceed." The third vehicle rolled forward, heavier than the first two, carrying additional gear and personnel because efficiency had replaced caution, and halfway across, the bridge responded with a long metallic groan that carried clearly even over the engines. This time the laughter faltered. A private frowned. "That didn't sound good," he muttered. Someone else replied quickly, "It's just echo. Relax." The veteran watched the center span dip a fraction lower than before and failed to fully rebound as the vehicle cleared, the steel remembering the weight instead of forgetting it. He felt the same cold certainty he'd felt decades earlier on another temporary crossing in another country, where the math had been right but the assumptions had been wrong. "You're close," he said softly, not to alarm but to mark the moment. "One more like that and the bridge will start deciding for you." That earned another wave of dismissive looks, sharper now because discomfort breeds defensiveness. "Sir," the platoon sergeant said, irritation creeping in, "with respect, you're not in the chain here." The veteran nodded. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm still talking." The fourth vehicle approached, and this time soldiers actually watched, tension threading through their posture, jokes dying mid-sentence as the truck eased onto the deck. The bridge sagged visibly now, enough that even untrained eyes noticed, and the ravine below seemed to open wider, darker. A sharp metallic ping rang out, small, quick, unmistakable, and the veteran's head snapped toward the sound. "Stop," he said, louder than before. "Stop the crossing." The driver hesitated, radio crackling with overlapping commands, and the platoon leader raised a hand, indecision flickering for the first time. Truck rolled another meter before braking, and the bridge answered with a deeper groan, the sound stretching longer like steel arguing with itself. Silence fell. No one laughed. The platoon leader swallowed and keyed his radio. "Hold position," he ordered. "All vehicles hold." The veteran moved closer to the railing, peering down at the supports, eyes tracking micro-movements most people missed. The way one girder trembled out of rhythm with the others, the way dust trickled from a joint that should have been sealed. "This isn't a failure yet," he said evenly. "This is a warning." A private whispered, "What happens if it fails?" No one answered him because the answer was obvious and terrible. The platoon leader wiped sweat from his temple and looked at the load chart again as if numbers might save them. "We're still under," he said, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. The veteran shook his head slowly. "You're under on paper," he replied. "You're over in reality." Before the platoon leader could respond, another sharp metallic snap echoed from beneath the deck, louder than before, followed by a subtle but undeniable drop. Just a few centimeters, but enough to make every soldier feel it in their knees. The driver's voice cracked over the radio. "Sir, the deck just shifted." The veteran didn't say "I told you so." He stepped forward, authority settling into his posture without effort. "Back the vehicle off," he said. "Slow, straight, no throttle spikes." The platoon leader hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded sharply. "Do it," he ordered. As the driver eased back, the bridge protested with a grinding groan, and the soldiers held their breath, watching the structure decide whether it would forgive or punish. The vehicle made it off, and the bridge settled again, not returning to its original shape, but holding, wounded. The ravine fell silent except for wind and creaking metal, and the lesson hovered unfinished in the air. The warning had been ignored long enough to cost safety, but not yet long enough to cost lives, and the margin was vanishing. The silence around the bridge was no longer casual. It was alert, stretched tight like a wire pulled too far, and the young soldiers stood frozen in place, eyes fixed on the sagging deck as if watching it might somehow hold it together. The laughter from earlier felt distant and embarrassing now, replaced by the unmistakable awareness that the structure beneath them was no longer following plans or charts, but responding to stress in its own language. The veteran moved slowly along the edge of the ravine, crouching to inspect a support beam where fine dust continued to sift down in an uneven line, each grain a quiet signal that weight was redistributing in dangerous ways. "You see that?" he asked, not accusing, simply pointing. The platoon leader stepped closer, face tight, and nodded reluctantly. "I see movement," he admitted. The veteran straightened and finally met his eyes fully. That means the bridge has started choosing how it fails, he said, and once that starts, you don't get to vote. The words hit harder than any raised voice because they weren't dramatic, they were factual. The platoon leader swallowed and glanced back at his troops, seeing them now not as numbers on a roster, but as men standing on a structure that might not forgive another mistake. Before he could issue further orders, engines sounded again from the far side of the ravine as a recovery vehicle approached, heavier than the others, loaded with spare equipment and personnel who hadn't been briefed on the instability yet. A murmur of unease rippled through the soldiers. "That thing can't come across," someone whispered. The veteran's head snapped up. "Stop it," he said sharply, and for the first time that day his voice carried command rather than suggestion. The platoon leader reacted instantly, radio up. "Recovery, halt where you are," he ordered. The reply came back confused. "We're cleared on the manifest," the driver said. "Bridge is rated negative," the platoon leader cut in, more force in his voice than before. "Do not approach." The veteran watched the far anchoring plate shift another fraction of an inch and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. "If that vehicle touches the deck," he said quietly, "the test will be over." The platoon leader looked at him sharply. "What test?" he asked. The veteran didn't answer immediately. He tapped the side of the bridge with the toe of his boot, listening to the hollow ring that came back uneven, wrong. "The weight test you started without realizing it," he replied. As if on cue, another metallic crack sounded from beneath the deck, louder and sharper than before, followed by a visible shudder that ran the length of the bridge like a muscle spasm. Several soldiers stumbled, instinctively reaching for balance. One private swore under his breath. "Sir," he said to the platoon leader, fear no longer hidden, "this thing's going to give." The platoon leader felt sweat bead at his hairline and turned fully toward the veteran now, authority draining from rank and flowing toward experience. "What do we do?" he asked, and the question carried more than tactics, it carried surrender. The veteran answered without hesitation, his tone steady. "You unload the bridge completely," he said. "No vehicles, no personnel, no shortcuts. You secure the approaches, mark it unsafe, and you reroute." The platoon leader hesitated, glancing at the schedule, the route plan, the time pressure that had driven every decision so far, and then he shook his head as if physically discarding it. "Do it," he ordered. "Everyone back, now." Soldiers moved quickly, no complaints, no jokes, retreating from the structure with a new respect that bordered on fear. As the last man stepped off the deck, the bridge responded with a low, prolonged groan, the sound of steel settling into a position it would not leave easily again. The veteran watched it carefully, counting seconds, waiting for the inevitable. A moment later, with no dramatic collapse but a decisive finality, the center span dipped another several inches and locked there, twisted just enough to make the failure unmistakable. The bridge had not fallen, but it was finished. The weight test had failed. A stunned silence followed as the soldiers stared at what could have happened had they pushed one more vehicle, one more minute, one more joke. In the distance, command vehicles kicked up dust as senior officers arrived, drawn by reports of instability, and the veteran straightened slowly, hands resting at his sides, eyes still on the damaged span. "You were lucky," he said quietly, not as praise, but as warning. The platoon leader nodded, unable to argue. "We were wrong," he admitted. The veteran finally looked away from the bridge and toward the approaching command vehicles, his expression unreadable. "Wrong happens," he said. "Ignoring warnings is what makes it permanent." The senior command vehicles arrived in a low cloud of dust that settled slowly around the damaged bridge, as if the ground itself wanted the moment to be taken seriously. And when the doors opened, the soldiers instinctively snapped to attention, posture rigid, nerves tight, because something irreversible had just happened and everyone felt it. The colonel stepped out first, scanning the twisted span with a sharp, professional eye, followed by a general whose presence silenced even the wind that moved through the ravine. And as he took in the scene, the unloaded bridge, the pulled-back troops, the visible deformation, his gaze stopped on the old veteran standing near the edge, hands relaxed, face calm. The general slowed, recognition dawning gradually, then all at once, his expression shifting from assessment to disbelief. "I thought you retired," he said quietly. The veteran gave a small nod. "I did," he replied, "from command." The colonel glanced between them, confused, sensing history he hadn't been briefed on. The general stepped closer to the bridge, crouched briefly to inspect a support beam, then straightened and turned back to the veteran. "You warned them," he said. It wasn't a question. The veteran nodded once. More than once. The general exhaled slowly, then faced the platoon leader, whose jaw was clenched tight with a mix of fear and humility. "Why was the load not reduced?" the general asked. The platoon leader opened his mouth, then closed it, realizing excuses would sound hollow here. We trusted the rating, he admitted. The general's eyes flicked back to the veteran. And you trusted experience, he said. Then, without ceremony, the general took a step back, heels together, posture straight, and rendered a crisp salute to the old man. The gesture cut through the soldiers like electricity. A general saluting a civilian-looking veteran in a faded red shirt was not something training prepared them for. The veteran hesitated, discomfort flickering briefly, then returned the salute with perfect precision, muscle memory overriding modesty. The general lowered his hand and spoke to the formation. This man wrote the field guidance many of you study, he said evenly. He investigated failures like this after people died. He knows when steel is lying. A collective breath left the troops, shame settling in heavy layers. The general turned to the damaged bridge again. This did not collapse because he was heard, he continued. Had he been ignored 10 minutes longer, I'd be calling families instead of engineers. The words landed hard, final. The platoon leader felt his throat tight, the full weight of consequence crashing down not as punishment, but as realization. He stepped forward, saluted the veteran himself, and said quietly, I mocked your warning. The veteran met his eyes without judgment. You weren't mocking me, he replied. You were mocking risk. Risk doesn't care. The general nodded, satisfied that the lesson had been delivered where it mattered most. This exercise is terminated, he ordered. Not because you failed, but because you learned before it cost lives. He looked at the bridge one last time. That's as close as you ever want to get. As command staff began coordinating reroutes and engineers moved in to secure the site, the soldiers stood in silence, watching the veteran walk slowly along the ravine edge, his worn boots crunching gravel. The same man they had laughed at hours earlier now revealed as the quiet reason they were all still standing. The bridge remained closed as dusk settled over Coldwater Training Range, its twisted center span silhouetted against a sky turning amber and gray. A quiet monument to a mistake that had stopped just short of tragedy, and the soldiers moved around it with a new restraint, voices low, movements deliberate, as if the ground itself were listening now. The exercise schedule was scrapped without argument, reroute markers hammered into place by engineers while command vehicles idled nearby, and no one complained about lost time, because time had suddenly revealed its real cost. The veteran stood a short distance away, watching the process with the same calm patience he'd shown all day, notebook tucked under his arm, white beard catching the fading light, and when the platoon leader approached him again, there was no trace of the earlier confidence in his posture, only sincerity. Sir, he said, voice steady but subdued, we trusted numbers over judgment. The veteran nodded slowly. Numbers are tools, he replied. Judgment is what tells you when the tool no longer fits the job. Around them, young soldiers gathered their gear, helmets under arms, eyes occasionally flicking toward the damaged bridge, each glance reinforcing a lesson that no classroom could have delivered. A private spoke up quietly, not looking for attention. If we'd pushed one more truck, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The veteran answered anyway. Then you'd be standing somewhere else right now, he said, not harshly, just honestly. The general, preparing to depart, paused once more beside the veteran. You saved us paperwork, he said dryly. The veteran allowed himself the faintest smile. I've filled enough of it for a lifetime, he replied. The general's expression softened. You still see it before it happens, he said. That's rare. The veteran looked back at the bridge, then at the soldiers now waiting for transport. It's not rare, he said. It's just ignored. As night crept in, the platoon formed up without being told, a quiet discipline settling over them that hadn't been there that morning, and the platoon leader addressed them plainly. Today wasn't about a bridge, he said. It was about listening before something breaks. No one laughed. No one rolled their eyes. The veteran watched them load up and prepare to move along the longer, safer route, spacing carefully, weight redistributed, procedures adjusted. Not because doctrine demanded it, but because experience had just been given a voice they would remember. When the convoy finally pulled away, headlights cutting through the dusk, the veteran remained behind for a moment, standing alone near the ravine, listening to the bridge creak softly as it cooled. A sound he knew well from years of investigations and after-action reports written in quieter places than this. He turned and walked away slowly, worn boots crunching gravel, faded red shirt disappearing into shadow. Content not with recognition, but with the knowledge that today, warning had beaten consequence by a narrow margin. In the weeks that followed, the story traveled through the unit, not exaggerated, not heroic, just factual. And every time a rating was quoted, someone asked what assumptions sat beneath it, Every time a structure was crossed, weight was spaced and patience practiced, and no one laughed when a quiet voice said, "Wait." The bridge would be dismantled and replaced, the paperwork filed, the training resumed, but the lesson would stay, carried forward by soldiers who had learned the rarest skill not through loss, but through humility. That experience doesn't shout, warnings don't repeat forever, and sometimes the difference between a close call and a catastrophe is whether you listen to the man who has already seen how it ends.